Usually, when we talk about building a bridge, there's this uh, fundamental expectation of structural consensus. Like, imagine two teams of engineers starting on opposite sides of this massive raging river,
Right. Yeah.
and they're working for the exact same blueprint. They're using the same math, the same physics, the same material science, and they build out over the water section by section. And eventually,
They meet in the middle.
exactly, the steel
Yeah.
beams meet perfectly in the middle, they bolt together, and you have this solid, reliable path.
And I mean, it works because it's a unified project, right? It's grounded in a shared objective language. Like the engineers might argue about, I don't know, the work schedule or the budget, but they don't disagree on the law of
What a
gravity.
tensile strength of steel, yeah.
Exactly.
But then you step into the world of modern democracy and you look at all the different competing worldviews trying to coexist, and suddenly that shared blueprint is just completely gone.
Oh, completely. It's vanished.
We're looking at this societal landscape where one team is using the language of like biological engineering, empirical data, and materialist science, and the other team is reading from ancient sacred texts, operating on divine revelation and absolute moral imperatives.
Which is, the absolute definition of a structural and communicative crisis.
Yeah.
I mean, we have these immense factions of society trying to build a bridge to one another, trying to actually form a functioning, peaceful state, but they don't even agree on what the bridge is made of, or honestly, why they're building it in the
Oh,
first place.
right.
You have the rise of what we call hard scientism, which is the belief that human beings are ultimately just biological machines.
That science is the only valid lens for reality.
Exactly. And colliding directly into that, you have the global resurgence of religious orthodoxies, which completely defies that that 20th century assumption that religion would just quietly fade away as technology advanced.
Which brings us to the core mission of our deep dive today. We are exploring the work of the eminent German philosopher Jürgen Habermas, specifically his massive, really ambitious text, Between Naturalism and Religion, Philosophical Essays.
It's a dense one, for sure.
It is, but we want to figure out how these radically opposed worldviews can actually coexist in a democratic state without just tearing each other apart. So for you, the listener, if you're trying to navigate this incredibly polarized world and wondering how we find common ground without abandoning our own fundamental truths, that is the puzzle we're going to try to solve today.
And to even begin solving that puzzle, Habermas suggests we actually have to understand the fundamental architecture of human communication. And what is incredibly rare for a philosopher of his stature.
Because he's known for this really dense, highly abstract, systemic theory, right?
Right. But he actually grounds this monumental theory in a very intimate autobiographical reflection.
I was completely caught off guard by that when I was reading. You see a title like Between Naturalism and Religion, and you just expect to be hit with impenetrable academic jargon on page one.
Yeah.
But he starts by talking about his childhood.
Yeah. He was born with a cleft palate.
Right.
And he underwent a series of deeply traumatic surgeries right after he was born and then had to endure them again at the age of 5. So this left him with a severe, very noticeable speech impediment throughout his entire childhood.
He writes about how other kids responded to him. And it wasn't just like typical schoolyard bullying.
No, it was worse.
It was a profound social alienation. When he tried to speak, other children literally didn't understand him, and their reaction was often just annoyance or outright rejection. He experienced firsthand at the most vulnerable age possible what it actually means to be marginalized because your attempts at communication physically break down.
And that experience of broken communication, it became the bedrock of his entire worldview. For young Habermas, the inability to make himself understood wasn't just frustrating, it was an existential threat.
Wow.
It made him realize that human beings are uniquely, kind of terrifyingly vulnerable creatures. And our only real protection is our connection to one another. He realized that we are deeply, unavoidably dependent on intersubjective networks.
Okay, intersubjective networks. That sounds like we're plugging our brains into a router or something. What does that actually look like in the context of, a child trying to speak to his classmates?
Well, it means that our sense of self isn't generated in isolation. So the traditional way we think about the human mind, going all the way back to, like, Rene Descartes, is that we are these isolated, self-enclosed minds.
I think, therefore I am.
Exactly. That implies that I exist independently, locked inside my own skull, looking out at the world through the windows of my eyes. Habermas completely rejects that.
No, he uses this really vivid image. The glove turned inside out.
Yes. It is such a brilliant way to visualize it. If you take a woven glove and turn it inside out, you suddenly see the complex stitching, right? All the threads that hold it together. Habermas is saying that human subjectivity, our inner private mind, is exactly like that.
Okay.
It's woven from the strands of intersubjectivity, meaning the interactions between subjects. We actually construct our internal consciousness using the public, culturally shared tools of language.
So we don't have a private language.
No, every single word you use to think about yourself was taught to you by someone else.
That is wild. So my inner monologue, my absolute deepest sense of me, is actually made out of social material. I literally can't even know who I am without other people reflecting me back to myself.
Exactly. He argues that we first become aware of ourselves in the gaze of another person. The way others look at us, the way they speak to us, it actually possesses this individuating power. We become individuals only by externalizing ourselves through communication.
And when that communication fails,
Right. When it fails, you realize that this invisible medium of language is the only thing holding human society and human identity together.
but, this philosophy wasn't just forged in the isolation of a schoolyard for him. There was a much darker historical crucible for Habermas. I mean, he was coming of age in Germany in 1945.
Right, the fall of the Nazi regime. Habermas was a teenager. He was part of a cohort that he describes as having the good fortune to be born late.
Right, meaning they were too young to be legally or morally incriminated by the atrocities of the Third Reich.
But they were old enough to fully comprehend the absolute moral rupture in civilization that the Holocaust represented.
He specifically mentions listening to the Nuremberg trials being broadcast on the radio. And I ask you, the listener, to pause and imagine the psychological shock of that. You are a teenager. You've grown up in a society that presented itself as completely normal and ordered, and suddenly the curtain is pulled back.
Yeah, it's unimaginable.
You realize the adults in charge, the legal system, the military, the entire societal apparatus was actually pathological and profoundly criminal.
And that realization instilled in him this lifelong suspicion of state power that operates without genuine public consent. He saw firsthand that you cannot rely on the administrative machinery of a state to guarantee morality. I mean, the Nazi regime had laws, they had administrators, they had judges.
But they lacked a moral communicative core.
Exactly. And it wasn't just the politicians that failed him either. He watched the intellectuals fail too.
Oh, right.
The failure of the intellectuals was perhaps the deepest betrayal for him. Habermas had been an avid reader of Martin Heidegger, who was, one of the most brilliant philosophers of the 20th century. But Heidegger had been a member of the Nazi Party.
Right.
And after the war, instead of taking moral responsibility, Heidegger stubbornly brushed off his fascist sympathies as a mere destiny of being.
Just totally deflecting.
Yeah, he treated the Holocaust as this sort of inevitable, abstract technological tragedy, completely sidestepping the actual agonizing human responsibility.
And Habermas famously tore into him for that.
Mhm.
He realized that pure intellect, when it's disconnected from the moral reality of human suffering and human equality, is incredibly dangerous. He realized that a democracy can't just be imposed from the top down by brilliant elites or, administrators. It actually has to live in the daily interactions of the citizens. It requires a vibrant, discursive public arena.
Which is what leads him to this massive philosophical challenge. Because he needs to figure out how to ground human reason, not in the abstract heavens of pure thought, but in the muddy reality of social communication.
Right.
He needs a system where the rules of democracy aren't handed down by a dictator or even a philosopher king, but are generated by the citizens themselves.
But hold on, let me play devil's advocate here. If my mind is woven from the outside society, like the inside-out glove, and if all our laws have to come from public communication, aren't we just entirely reliant on the crowd? Like, if I'm just a product of whatever society I happen to be born into, where does independent critical thought even come in? How do we avoid just falling into relativism where the loudest mob makes the rules?
That tension is literally the central project of his career. He wants to save the concept of universal reason, the idea that some things are objectively true or morally right without relying on ancient metaphysics or religious dogma.
Okay, so how does he do it?
To do this, he turns to the Enlightenment philosopher Immanuel Kant, but he puts Kant through a process he calls detranscendentalizing.
Okay, we need to translate that immediately because detranscendentalizing is one of those phrases that makes people just instantly tune out.
Fair enough.
Kant had this idea of pure reason, right? He operated in what Habermas calls a mentalistic framework.
Yeah, so Think of Kant's view of reason as a solitary genius sitting in a silent room, closing his eyes, and tapping into a universal, transcendent realm of logic that exists totally outside of time and space. Kant thought reason was a property of the isolated individual mind confronting the universe.
Kind of like a mathematician discovering a geometric proof that has always existed out there somewhere.
Exactly. And Habermas looks at that and says, that's way too abstract. It doesn't help us figure out how to actually live together in a messy, pluralistic society. So he detranscendentalizes Kant.
He brings it down to earth.
Right. He brings that lofty, magical reason down to earth and embeds it in our everyday language. He calls this new framework formal pragmatics.
Okay, so instead of reason being this geometric proof floating in the ether, reason is something we actually do when we talk to each other.
Yes. Reason is hidden in the very structure of conversation. Habermas argues that every single time you open your mouth to make a serious claim to another human being, you are implicitly agreeing to a set of invisible, inescapable rules. He calls these the unavoidable presuppositions of communication.
Okay, let's walk through these, because this is where the philosophy actually meets our daily life. If I'm arguing with a coworker about, say, how to organize a project, Habermas says I'm bound by 4 rules, whether I realize it or not. What's the first one?
The first is the assumption of an objective world. When you tell your coworker the project deadline is Friday, you both have to pragmatically assume there is a single shared reality out there, a reality that includes calendars, time, and, the company you work for.
That makes total sense.
Mm-hmm.
If we didn't assume a shared objective world, my words wouldn't have any anchor. I wouldn't be communicating, I'd just be making sounds. We have to agree the table exists before we can argue about what's on it.
Exactly.
Okay, what's the second rule?
Yeah. The second is rationality, or accountability. You have to assume that your coworker is actually capable of understanding your point and capable of providing a reason for their own actions.
Right.
If you thought they were completely irrational, like, I don't know, a malfunctioning machine or a rock, you wouldn't try to persuade them with an argument. You would just try to manipulate them or physically move them out of the way. The very act of arguing implies respect for their agency.
That's fascinating. Like, I might think my coworkers' ideas are terrible, but the mere fact that I'm arguing with them proves I think they have a mind that can be changed.
Exactly. And the third presupposition is the unconditionality of truth claims. When you make a statement, you are inherently claiming that it is true, and not just, true for you on a Tuesday, but unconditionally true. You are orienting yourself toward truth, and you are open to being proven wrong if better evidence is presented.
Okay, and the fourth one, because I know this is the one that really builds the bridge from private conversations all the way up to democratic politics.
Mm-hmm. Right. The fourth is the necessity of inclusive argumentation. If your claim about the project deadline is challenged, you have to assume that a genuinely rational discourse could, in principle, resolve the dispute. And for a discourse to be genuinely rational, it has to be inclusive.
Meaning everyone gets a say.
Right. You can't exclude relevant voices, you can't use deception, and crucially, you cannot use coercion. The only force allowed in this ideal conversation is what Habermas famously calls the unforced force of the better argument.
The unforced force of the better argument. I just love that phrase. It means if we are really arguing, I can't just pull rank. I can't say, we're doing it my way because I'm the boss.
No, because that's not communication.
Right, that's just a threat. If I'm actually engaging in discourse, I have to let the logic and the evidence do the heavy lifting.
And by identifying these 4 rules, Habermas proves that you don't need a magical transcendent realm to have universal morality or logic. The rules of fairness, equality, and truth-seeking are just baked into the very biology and sociology of human speech.
So it's like an inescapable trap.
It is an incredible intellectual trap. If you try to argue against these rules, you end up contradicting yourself because you literally have to use the rules of communication to make your argument that they don't exist.
But this brings us to a major scholarly dispute within the text itself. Habermas's colleague, Karl Otto Appel, looks at these rules of communication and says, great, we've solved everything. We can just derive our entire moral and legal system directly from these rules.
Right. Appel believes that because communication inherently requires equal respect and truthfulness, we have this direct ultimate justification for a moral society. He basically views law and politics merely as tools to enforce this overarching communicative morality.
But Habermas pumps the brakes on that pretty hard. Why? If these rules of speech are so foundational, why can't we just build our laws directly out of them?
Because Habermas recognizes that modern society is incredibly complex, and modern law is fundamentally coercive. Like, when the state passes a tax law, it doesn't just ask you nicely to comply based on the unforced force of the better argument.
No, it definitely doesn't.
It will seize your assets or put you in jail if you don't pay. So Habermas argues that you cannot just logically deduce a coercive tax code from the abstract fact that we have to be honest when we speak.
I see. You can't bridge the gap between we shouldn't lie to each other in a debate and the capital gains tax should be 15%.
Exactly. So Habermas introduces this concept of the co-originality of law and democracy. The rules of discourse give us a procedure, a fair way to have a debate, but they don't give us the actual substance of the laws.
Right.
For that, a democratic state needs a political lawmaker. The citizens have to take that fair procedure and apply it to their specific, messy historical reality to actually generate positive law. Morality and law are two separate tracks that have to emerge together.
And that shifts our focus perfectly from how two individuals talk to how a massive society governs itself. We are moving from the micro level of a conversation to the macro level of the state. Because, it's one thing to use formal pragmatics to argue about a tax code. It is an entirely different thing when citizens enter the public square to argue about the fundamental nature of life, death, and the universe.
Right. And when the public sphere is fractured by these overarching worldviews, when you have deeply religious citizens standing next to staunchly secular citizens, the shared reality required for communication starts to really break down. Which brings us to a concept in the text known as Buchenferde's dilemma.
Ernst Wolfgang Buchenferde. He was a legal scholar who asked a truly brilliant and genuinely unsettling question about the modern state. He essentially asked, can the pacified secular democratic state survive without relying on normative presuppositions that it cannot itself guarantee?
Which highlights the ultimate vulnerability of a liberal democracy. Think about it. A secular state needs its citizens to share a basic moral consensus. It needs them to play by the rules, to respect the dignity of their opponents, and to feel a sense of civic solidarity.
Right.
If citizens don't have that internal solidarity, the state would have to rely entirely on police force and surveillance to maintain order, which obviously destroys the democracy.
But the state itself is strictly neutral. The government doesn't teach a specific religion. It doesn't mandate a specific philosophy of life. So where does this civic solidarity even come from?
That's the dilemma.
Buchenferde's anxiety is that the secular state is secretly freeloading off of religious and ethical traditions that it officially ignores. It is living on the inherited moral capital of the past, and as religion fades in the West, that capital is being depleted.
And we can see the acute stress of this depletion in polarized societies today. Habermas actually looks at the political divide in the United States as a prime structural example of this. He notes how voters frequently prioritize deeply entrenched cultural and religious orientations over their own concrete economic interests.
He summarizes this as the debate over God, gays, and guns. And I want to pause here and note for you, the listener, that Habermas isn't analyzing this to take a side on those specific policies, and neither are we. We are strictly observing the structural reality of the public sphere. When the political culture polarizes along the fault line of secular versus religious conflicts, whether the debate is over embryonic stem cell research or end-of-life care or the definition of marriage, it challenges the very foundation of liberal citizenship.
Because in those debates, the citizens aren't just disagreeing on a budget. They are disagreeing on the fundamental definition of human life and moral duty. And the democratic state is supposed to be this neutral arbiter. It has to protect religious communities from the hostility of a rapidly secularizing society, and simultaneously, it has to protect secular citizens from having religious doctrines imposed upon them by law.
But Habermas points out that this coexistence cannot just be a modus vivendi. It can't just be a grudging, cynical truce where both sides are merely tolerating each other until they get enough power to crush the other side.
Right. A democracy sustained only by temporary exhaustion won't survive. It requires actual conviction from the citizens.
So how does the state foster that conviction without violating its own neutrality? Habermas examines the classic liberal answer to this problem, specifically the one proposed by the highly influential political philosopher John Rawls. Rawls introduced the concept of the public use of reason.
And the idea behind the public use of reason seems very logical on its face. Rawls argued that when citizens enter the political public sphere to debate fundamental issues of justice or constitutional essentials, they must leave their comprehensive religious or philosophical doctrines at the door.
Yep.
If you want to advocate for a law, you are only allowed to use secular public arguments that are equally accessible to everyone.
Meaning you cannot stand on the floor of the Senate and say, we must pass this law because it is commanded in the book of Leviticus.
Yeah.
Because that reason is completely inaccessible to a Hindu or an atheist or a Muslim. You have to translate your desire for that law into a language of universal rights or public welfare.
Which, like you said, sounds incredibly fair. It keeps the public square neutral. But Habermas mounts a profound critique of Rawls here. He argues that this requirement places an unfair, asymmetric cognitive burden on religious citizens.
Let's unpack that, an asymmetric cognitive burden.
Habermas points out that Rawls fundamentally misunderstands the nature of religious belief. For a devout person, religion isn't just a hobby. It isn't a private club membership that you can take off like a coat when you enter the public square.
No, it's their entire worldview.
Exactly. Religion is the core of their identity. It provides their entire moral vocabulary and their framework for understanding reality itself.
So to force a religious citizen to artificially split their identity, to demand that they invent a secular justification for a moral intuition that is entirely rooted in their faith before they are even allowed to speak, is an unreasonable burden. It essentially marginalizes them in their own democracy. It tells them their deepest voice is illegitimate in the public square.
Meanwhile, the secular citizen doesn't have to change anything at all. Their everyday language is already the language of the state. Hence, the burden is asymmetric.
So Habermas has kind of boxed us into a corner here. We can't force religious people to be entirely secular in public because that's oppressive, but we also can't allow laws to be passed based purely on religious dogma because that leads to theocracy. What is his mechanism for escape?
The mechanism is what Habermas calls a complementary learning process. He demands that both sides undergo a massive, uncomfortable cognitive shift. Let's look at the burden placed on the religious citizens first. They must learn to reconcile their faith with the reality of a pluralistic society.
What does that mean in practice, though?
Well, it means religious citizens must accept the epistemic authority of secular science. They cannot demand that the state teach creationism as biology, for instance.
Right.
Furthermore, they must accept the priority of secular constitutional law over religious law. They have to accept that they live in a society where their specific divine revelation will not be the law of the land, and they must grant equal rights to other faiths and to non-believers.
Which is a colossal historical undertaking for any religious tradition. But historically, theology has often acted as a pacemaker for this, slowly adjusting to new scientific and political realities over centuries. But the truly revolutionary part of Habermas's theory is that the secular citizen has to do work too. It's a complementary process. So what does a secular citizen have to learn? Are they supposed to start pretending to believe in miracles?
No, not at all. Secular citizens are not asked to abandon their secularity or embrace supernaturalism, but they are asked to overcome secularism when it functions as a rigid, dogmatic worldview.
What does that mean?
It's the assumption that religion is nothing more than archaic, irrational nonsense that belongs in the dustbin of history. Habermas says they have to adopt what he calls post-metaphysical thinking.
Post-metaphysical thinking?
Yes, a post-metaphysical mindset remains strictly agnostic. It doesn't judge the validity of divine revelation, but it remains open to the idea that major world religions might contain deeply rational moral intuitions and encoded semantic potentials that are still absolutely vital for society.
He demands hermeneutic open-mindedness from the secularist. So, when a religious citizen speaks in the public sphere using religious language, the secular citizen shouldn't just roll their eyes and dismiss them. They have to actively listen. They have to engage in a cooperative endeavor to translate the core moral truth of that religious speech into a secular language that everyone can access.
A perfect example is the Judeo-Christian concept that all human beings are created in the image of God.
Yeah.
A secular citizen doesn't have to believe in God to recognize the immense moral weight of that statement. They can work alongside the religious citizen to translate that theological concept into the secular legal language of universal human dignity and inalienable human rights.
Oh, I love that. The secular citizen isn't surrendering to religion. They are mining it for moral wisdom. Philosophy acts as a translator. Habermas acknowledges that secular philosophy is often dry and procedural. It lacks the community-binding power, the rich narratives, and the deep existential consolation that religion naturally provides. When a society faces a profound crisis, like the accelerating destruction of the environment or the isolating effects of modern capitalism, religion often possesses vocabulary to articulate what is broken long before secular language can catch up.
And by translating these concepts rather than just discarding them, the secular state regenerates its own moral infrastructure. It solves Buchenwald's dilemma not by freeloading off religion, but by actively partnering with it in the public sphere.
This requires a profound level of respect from the secular side. But that respect evaporates entirely if secularism hardens into its most extreme form. If the secular mindset decides that science isn't just a tool, but the only valid description of reality, we cross into dangerous territory.
Very dangerous. That extreme form is what Habermas calls hard naturalism, or scientism. It is the belief that absolutely everything in the universe, including our choices, our morality, our emotions, and our consciousness, is just biology and physics. It is the view that human beings are merely complex biochemical algorithms.
And this isn't just an abstract debate for philosophers in armchairs, right? Habermas points directly to neuroscience, specifically the famous experiments conducted by Benjamin Libet in the 1970s. These experiments literally shook the foundations of how we understand free will.
Oh, yeah. Benjamin Libet set out to investigate human volition. He hooked subjects up to EEG machines to monitor their brain activity and asked them to make a simple, spontaneous decision. Flick your wrist whenever you feel the urge to do so.
Okay.
He also had them watch a highly precise clock to note the exact millisecond they consciously felt the urge to move.
And the results were deeply unsettling for anyone who believes in free will.
Libet found that a specific neurological brainwave, a readiness potential in the brain's motor cortex, occurred hundreds of milliseconds before the subject reported being consciously aware of the decision to move.
Wow. So the brain fired before the mind decided. The neurological hardware initiated the action before the conscious software even knew what was happening.
For reductionist neuroscientists and hard naturalists, this was the smoking gun. They argue that this data proves the brain makes decisions automatically based on a chain of physical causes. Our conscious feeling of free will, the feeling that I chose to flick my wrist, is just a post hoc illusion.
An illusion.
Yeah, it's just a story the brain tells itself after the fact to make us feel like we are the authors of our own lives.
But if that reductionist interpretation is true, we are completely determined by the laws of biology. And if free will is a biological illusion, our entire societal structure collapses. You cannot have a justice system if no one actually chooses to commit a crime. It was just their neurons firing. You cannot have a moral consensus if no one is actually making moral choices.
And Habermas recognizes this as an existential threat to the self-understanding of acting subjects. If we believe we are just machines, we will start treating each other like machines. So he mounts a rigorous defense of what he calls soft naturalism.
Okay, soft naturalism. Does he deny the science?
No, he doesn't deny the neurological data of the Libet experiments. He isn't anti-science, but he completely rejects the philosophical conclusion that free will is an illusion.
How does he escape the trap of the readiness potential then? If the brain fires first, how do we still have freedom?
He introduces the concept of an inescapable dualism of epistemic perspectives. He argues that there are two fundamentally different but equally valid ways of knowing the world. The first is the observer perspective.
Okay.
This is the perspective of the scientist looking at the fMRI scan or the EEG readout. From this third-person perspective, everything is an object. Everything is a causal chain of natural events. Brain state A causes brain state B.
But there is a second perspective.
Yes, the
Yeah.
participant perspective. This is the first-person and second-person perspective we inhabit when we were actually living in the world, talking to each other, and making decisions. From this perspective, we don't operate on causes. We operate on reasons.
That distinction between causes and reasons is crucial. Let's unpack that.
A neural firing is a physical cause. It forces an action in the physical world. But when you asked me why I voted for a specific political candidate, I don't give you a list of my neural firings. I give you a reason. I say, I voted for them because I agree with their economic policy. Reasons exist in a public, cultural space. They're part of the web of language and meaning. You cannot observe a reason in a brain scan, just like you can't find the concept of justice by putting a microscope on a law textbook.
So the hard naturalist takes the observer perspective and tries to use it to invalidate the participant perspective. They say, I can't see your reasons in the brain scan, therefore your reasons are illusions.
And Habermas says that is a massive category error. He argues that the participant perspective is not a hallucination. It is a profound evolutionary reality. The human species evolved this incredibly complex, biologically expensive apparatus of conscious rationality and social justification.
We wouldn't have it if we didn't need it.
Exactly. We wouldn't have developed the ability to exchange reasons if it were just a superfluous illusion, playing no functional role in our survival. Both perspectives were necessary for us to thrive. You need the observer perspective to understand gravity and build tools, but you need the participant perspective to build a society.
You cannot use the tools of the observer perspective to dismantle the participant perspective, because they are measuring two entirely different dimensions of reality. One measures the hardware, the other engages with the cultural software.
To deepen this point, Habermas actually brings in the philosophy of Theodor Adorno. Adorno was a central figure in the Frankfurt School, and he warned extensively about the dangers of instrumental reason.
Instrumental reason. Let's define that.
Instrumental reason is the mindset that views the world entirely through the observer perspective, seeing nature merely as an object to be quantified, manipulated, and dominated for human utility.
Adorno argued that this drive to master nature contains a dark, self-destructive logic, right? He called it the dialectic of enlightenment.
Exactly. The premise of the Enlightenment was to use science to free humanity from the terrifying unpredictability of nature. But Adorno warned that the more we try to technologically master external nature, the more that instrumental mindset turns inward. We start viewing human beings as objects to be quantified and manipulated. Our drive to dominate nature ends up making us dominate and objectify ourselves.
And Habermas applies this directly to the frontier of modern bioethics. He looks at the prospect of genetic engineering. Again, we're looking at this structurally, examining how technological capability impacts our philosophical self-understanding. What happens when we start treating the human genome as just another piece of external nature to be engineered?
Habermas argues that if parents begin shopping in a genetic supermarket, selecting traits for their unborn children, engineering their intelligence, their physical attributes, or their temperament, we cross a terrifying line. We threaten what he calls the unavailability of subjective nature.
Let's define unavailability carefully, because it's the linchpin of his argument against designer babies.
Right. To feel like a free, autonomous author of your own life. To occupy the participant perspective fully, you have to feel that your biological foundation is a given. It must be a roll of the natural dice. It must be unavailable for manipulation by another human being's intentions.
Because if it's available, I am no longer an equal. Think about the psychological impact of that. If I know that my musical talent or my athletic ability wasn't just a natural gift that I chose to cultivate, but was actually pre-programmed into me based on the preferences of my parents, how do I view my own achievements?
You are no longer acting as a peer among equals. You are, in a very real sense, a manufactured product of someone else's design. This destroys the fundamental symmetry of human relationships. In a moral community, we look at each other as mysterious, autonomous equals. But if you are biologically programmed by another person, you are alienated from your own inner nature. The spontaneity of who you are has been overridden by an engineer.
By trying to technologically master our own biology, by fully embracing the hard, naturalist observer perspective, we accidentally erase the very foundation of our freedom. We destroy the biological unpredictability that allows us to act as autonomous citizens in a democracy.
This is why Habermas insists that secular philosophy must constantly engage with religious and moral traditions. It brings him back to Immanuel Kant's philosophy of religion. Kant saw this problem, the coldness of pure reason, and tried to save the core of Christian ethics without the metaphysical baggage.
Kant had this beautiful concept of the kingdom of ends.
Yes. The kingdom of ends is the moral ideal, where every human being treats every other human being as an end in themselves, possessing absolute inherent dignity and never merely as a means to an end. Kant was trying to transform the religious vision of the kingdom of God into an inner-worldly ethical community based on rational duty.
So when Habermas talks about translating religion into secular language, is he just saying philosophy should cannibalize religion? Should we just strip mine the theology, keep the human rights concepts like the kingdom of ends, and throw the rest in the trash?
Oh no. Habermas insists this must not be a hostile takeover by secular philosophy. Philosophy must have the humility to acknowledge its own limits. A secular translation can capture the universal, legal principle of human dignity, but it cannot manufacture the deep existential consolation that a religious community provides in the face of death or tragedy. It cannot replace the community-binding rituals.
Philosophy can give you a right to a fair trial, but it can't comfort you at a funeral.
Precisely. Translation is a respectful, ongoing dialogue. Religion serves as a necessary irritant in a secular society. It constantly reminds us of the non-objectifiable dimensions of the human experience. It forces us to remember the participant perspective, preventing society from sliding into a hard naturalism where we treat humans like programmable meat.
Okay, we have built a massive intellectual architecture here. We started with the rules of how two individuals communicate. We scaled that up to how a secular state balances religious and secular worldviews. We examine the existential necessity of protecting our freedom from biological reductionism. Now, we have to push this to the absolute macro level. We have to look at global borders. How do we handle actual cultural friction on a planetary scale? How do we practice tolerance when we are dealing with fundamentally incompatible civilizations?
Habermas approaches this by demanding we redefine the very concept of tolerance. He looks back at the historical evolution of the term, examining Enlightenment thinkers like Pierre Bayle and Gotthold Ephraim Lessing, and he uncovers a crucial counterintuitive insight. True tolerance can only exist after discrimination and prejudice have been overcome.
That sounds backwards at first glance. Usually in casual conversation, we think of tolerance as the antidote to prejudice. We say, you need to be more tolerant of people who are different than you.
It's a common category mistake. Habermas clarifies that you don't tolerate someone based on prejudice. If someone is a racist or a homophobe, they aren't being asked to tolerate minorities. They're being asked to abandon their unjustifiable prejudices and recognize the equal constitutional rights of their fellow citizens. Overcoming prejudice is a matter of basic legal equality, not tolerance.
So if tolerance isn't about overcoming bigotry, what is it?
Tolerance comes into play only when you are dealing with a competing worldview that you fundamentally disagree with, but which you recognize as a legitimate, rationally held perspective. Tolerance is the cognitive endurance of cognitive dissonance.
Give me a practical example of that.
Imagine a devout Orthodox Catholic and a staunch secular atheist sharing a neighborhood. They hold comprehensive doctrines that are mutually exclusive. The atheist believes the Catholic is wasting their life on an illusion. The Catholic believes the atheist is disconnected from ultimate divine truth. Neither side is going to abandon their beliefs. But tolerance means they recognize that the other person's belief is held for reasons that are deeply tied to their identity and culture, not just rooted in blind malice.
So they tolerate each other despite fundamentally disagreeing. They endure the friction of sharing a society with someone whose ultimate truths contradict theirs, while still treating them as equal co-authors of the laws they both live under. Tolerance isn't about watering down your own beliefs. It's about holding your beliefs strongly while refusing to use the power of the state to crush your opponent.
Exactly. But this liberal idea of universal equality and tolerance is constantly under attack, not just from religious fundamentalists, but from the postmodern left. Habermas engages directly with thinkers like Christoph Menke, who offer a profound postmodern critique of equality.
Menke argues that the liberal concept of equal rights is inherently paradoxical and actually commits a form of consensual violence. How does equality become violent?
Well, Menke's argument is that human beings are incredibly complex, nuanced, and culturally embedded. When a liberal state forces everyone into the abstract, universal category of a legal citizen, it acts like a conceptual steamroller. It strips away their unique cultural differences, their specific religious needs, and their historical context in the name of treating everyone equally. Menke argues that by ignoring these differences, the state inflicts a kind of administrative violence on minority cultures, forcing them to conform to a dominant, supposedly neutral standard.
It's the critique that colorblind laws often just perpetuate the status quo of the dominant culture because they refuse to see the specific realities of marginalized groups. How does Habermas defend the liberal project against that? Does he just deny that it happens?
No, he acknowledges that historically, liberal systems have frequently failed. They have used the pretense of universal equality to cover up massive inequalities. But Habermas argues that Menke is confusing a practical historical failure with a conceptual contradiction. The flaw isn't in the concept of equality. The flaw is in the incomplete application of it.
The liberal project, for Habermas, isn't a static set of rules. It is a self-correcting learning process.
Yes. The cure for the failures of democracy is more democracy. When a marginalized group realizes that the universal laws of a nation don't truly include them, when they feel the violence of being ignored, they don't abandon the concept of rights. They use the very language of universal rights to demand inclusion. They force the public sphere to expand. They force the majority to realize that their definition of equality was too narrow. It is an ongoing, painful historical process of progressively decentering our perspectives and enlarging the definition of we.
Which brings us to the final frontier. If we can expand the we within a nation, can we expand it across the globe? Can we build a global public sphere?
Yeah.
Just as two citizens have to use formal pragmatics to argue without resorting to violence, nation-states have to figure out how to interact without resorting to war.
This is the ultimate macro application explored in Chapter 11. Habermas looks at the transition from classical, absolute national sovereignty to a cosmopolitan world order. He is updating Kant's centuries-old idea of a world republic for the complexities of the 21st century.
Because the current international system is deeply flawed. It often operates on the basis of hegemony, where dominant superpowers dictate the terms based on raw military and economic might, rather than acting through a binding legal framework.
Right. Habermas argues that as long as international relations are governed by the instrumental reason of competing superpowers, we will constantly be on the brink of catastrophic conflict. The only solution is to institutionalize the rules of discourse on a planetary scale. He analyzes specific United Nations reform proposals, in particular, the report from the high-level panel on threats, challenges, and change, to see how we might build a genuine cosmopolitan constitution.
He isn't just dreaming of a utopia then. He looks at the concrete mechanics of international law. What are the specific reforms he highlights that would shift the UN from a symbolic forum into a true global public sphere?
He focuses on three crucial shifts. First, the international community must strictly differentiate between peacekeeping missions, where troops are deployed to maintain a truce with the consent of the parties involved, and peace-enforcing missions, which involve active military intervention against a sovereign state. Blurring those lines destroys the legitimacy of international law.
And if military force is going to be used, it can't just be whenever a superpower feels vaguely threatened or wants to secure resources.
That leads to the second reform, establishing strict, universally applied criteria for the use of military force. A cosmopolitan order requires that force is truly a last resort, that the military means used are strictly proportional to the threat, and that there is a rigorous balance of consequences, meaning the intervention won't cause more suffering than it prevents. The UN must act like a rational participant in a discourse, demanding justifications that apply universally, not just exceptional rules for powerful nations.
And the third reform addresses what happens after the bombs stop falling.
The absolute necessity of post-conflict peacebuilding. Habermas argues that the international community cannot just sanction military interventions to stop a rogue actor and then walk away from the rubble. If the goal is a unified world order based on human rights, the UN must take on the long, constructive tasks of rebuilding infrastructure, establishing courts, and fostering a local public sphere where citizens can begin the process of democratic self-rule.
We are trying to take the moral consensus that is so incredibly difficult to build in a single neighborhood, and we are trying to institutionalize it on a planetary scale. We are trying to build a legal framework that forces nation-states to abandon their instrumental, dominance-driven instincts and act as rational participants in a global discourse.
That is the grand, ambitious vision of Habermas, a political constitution for a pluralist world society grounded in the undeniable reality of our communicative nature.
We have covered an immense amount of ground today. Let's pull all these threads together into a comprehensive summary of this journey. We started with the physical, biological reality of a young boy struggling to speak through a cleft palate, experiencing the terrifying isolation of broken communication. And we expanded that insight all the way out to the legal reality of the United Nations trying to prevent global warfare.
The through line connecting all of it, from the schoolyard to the global assembly, is that human beings are fundamentally social, communicative creatures. Our minds are built from the outside in, we are vulnerable, and our only defense is the intersubjective web of language and meaning that we weave together.
If we distill the core thesis of Between Naturalism and Religion, it all comes down to the survival of the democratic state. A democracy relies absolutely on the civic solidarity of its people. But the paradox is that this solidarity is something the state cannot enforce by law. You can legislate tax rates, you cannot legislate empathy, mutual respect, or the willingness to understand your opponent.
Therefore, survival in a pluralistic world demands a voluntary and often deeply uncomfortable cognitive shift from everyone involved. Both sides have to walk across that bridge we talked about at the beginning, even if it feels like the bridge is swaying over a chasm.
Religious people must embrace the realities of secular law and modern science. They have to accept that they live in a pluralistic world where their specific divine doctrine cannot dictate the coercive laws of the land.
And conversely, secular people must respect and translate the deep moral truths embedded in religious traditions. They must recognize that religion is not just irrational noise, but a reservoir of meaning that secular society desperately needs to avoid falling into cold, instrumental reason. Neither side can retreat into the absolute certainty of fundamentalism, and neither side can retreat into the absolute reductionism of hard scientism.
Which brings me to a final provocative thought for you, the listener, to mull over long after this deep dive ends. We spent a lot of time discussing how Habermas defends the participant perspective, the idea that our brains actually evolved to require meaning, morality, and mutual understanding. The exchange of reasons isn't an illusion, it's an evolutionary necessity.
Right.
If that is true, does the relentless modern pursuit of cold, hard naturalism paradoxically violate our very human nature? When we try to strip away all religious and moral frameworks, when we try to reduce ourselves and each other to nothing more than firing neurons, genetic algorithms, and predictable data points, are we not erasing the very evolutionary tool that allowed us to build civilizations in the first place? Think about that the next time you engage in a heated debate with someone who sees the world completely differently than you do. Are you looking at them through the observer perspective, trying to manipulate and engineer them as an object? Or are you looking at them through the participant perspective, trying to understand them as an equal?
That choice between manipulation and understanding is the ultimate test of our humanity.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep asking the hard questions, keep listening to the people across the bridge from you, and keep questioning the world around you. We'll see you next time.